not going to belabor his impressive credentials. The program does that. The publicity has done it. We're all here because of that background, because of the expertise that he brings to the table or brings to us tonight. But I'd like to emphasize the word all. Tonight is one of those rare occasions where members of all three faiths of Abraham are gathered in one room. The three faiths that acknowledge a reality that is greater than all, but is present in all. It's a reality that we all hold in common, but pursue by different paths. A reality we name Yahweh, a reality we name God, or a reality we name Allah. And we all gather here tonight in pursuit of a greater understanding among us. So please welcome Professor Ebrahim Moosa, a fellow pilgrim in this pursuit. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Frank, for that introduction. Thank you to Mark Odlin, and thank you to the speaker series of South Haven. The whole question of reform in contemporary Muslim world is possibly something that most of you, in one way or the other, have encountered through reading the newspapers, by looking at the world at large, by thinking about the various events that happened a couple of weeks ago in Paris, in Brussels, in London, in Spain, not to speak about 9/11, not think about Boston. So it's in that context of security issues, right, that Islam has become the main concern for most Americans. But I must also share with you that Islam is not only a concern for most Americans, it's also the biggest concern for most Muslims around the world. Because the biggest victims of Islamic violence and the largest number of victims of Islamic violence are Muslims first. And so this issue is an issue that we as a global community need to think about it in greater detail. And I think when we are equipped with some of the elementary issues at hand, I think we will slowly and gradually be able to get a handle on it. So I'm going to have many slides here tonight. Hopefully, all the slides you will memorize by the time I'm finished. And then there will be a quiz. But I don't worry that you have to get everything on the slide, okay? Don't worry about that. The reason I'm giving the slide is just to keep some order, but also for you to see words and names and places that might look strange. So let's start with a map of the Islamic world, and everywhere where there is green, that is the largest part of the Muslim world. Now, I think I'm going to have a quiz here. This country, which country in the world is that one here? This one in yellow here. And Muslim population 10 or 50%. See, you never thought the quiz will start that early. And that is Guyana. Okay? So Guyana has a 10%, more than 10% Muslim population. But here you see all this in green is a Muslim population of 50% above. And there you see France, you see parts of the Soviet Union, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. I have large, substantial numbers of Muslims. I come from this part of the world, South Africa, where there's 1 million Muslims in a population of 43 million. And these are all the Muslim majority areas. Now, as most of you know, Islam began in the 6th century. Muhammad was born in 570. He announced and declared his ministry in 610. And round about 570, 610, and then he preached for 12 years in Mecca, and then another 10 years in Medina. And so this part of the world, what we call Saudi Arabia, is the heartland of where Islam was born. But Islam very soon spread out into this area, which is the Levant, which is today Palestine, Israel, into this part of the world, into Iraq, into North Africa, after its beginning. And so the Muslim world today, one of the things that this map doesn't show is that there are also significant and influential numbers of Muslims in the United States. The estimate varies between 3 million to 7 million because we don't have exact numbers. Numbers of Muslims in the United States are also early communities of immigrants who came to some parts of the Midwest, and then also many converts to Islam amongst African American communities in the Nation of Islam in the 1950s and 60s, and then you had a number of immigrant Muslims. But now you have in Canada and in the US at least 3 to 4 generations of immigrant Muslims, not to talk about the African American Muslims who've been here long enough, came historically through the transatlantic slavery, and they've made this their home too. Although some of them had lost Islam, there was also a rediscovery of Islam amongst the African American Muslim community. Now, this question of a changing world order, and the question of change is always, and I'm going to talk about change, is that in every moment when the new is born, there are always morbid symptoms. And so one of the ways we think about this massive transformation that is happening globally, that these changes that are happening come under a great amount of pressure, disruption, and violence. And why is that so? We have to be alert to questions of history. If we are not aware of history, then we might be innocently thinking that things are just happening for the sake of happening. But there's history. And one of the ways that we can deal with these issues is to think about history in more careful terms. Henry Kissinger also, when he was Secretary of State for various U.S. presidents and so on, also observed of the importance of the international state of affairs, and also the question of pressures and how certain things are attacked and dismantled by design, and then the corrosion of some parts of the world, and then the rush of events. And any one of us who is looking at history in the last 10 years, say the last 17, 16 years, we know there's been a rush of events post 9/11. There's been developments around the world. We had the Arab Spring, with the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. We have the emergence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS that preceded that, but ISIS since then. And that we have the US forces going into Iraq and leaving Iraq and returning to Iraq, going into Afghanistan, returning from Afghanistan, and going back to Afghanistan now again. It's a fairly complicated story, and I think most Americans and people like you are trying to get a handle on what is this all about. And the one thing that keeps on coming to your mind is this thing called Islam, right? Because Islam is connected to this. And the way that Islam is connected to this is one of the things that we need to get a handle on, and be able to understand that how Islam is related to that. There's been the whole question about state development, and we've seen that the things that I've just said earlier, and how these issues have especially questions of violence, has impacted our psyches on a daily basis. This is Mumbai, the Taj Hotel that was attacked. This is in Nice, in a city in France. This one we all know is 9/11, when America was attacked by Al-Qaeda. The ideology of bin Ladenism is an ideology that stands behind, it's a recent incarnation of a certain form of Islamic radicalism that basically exploits Muslim grievances of developments of failing states, of despots who are ruling, of the way in which the international order have, to some extent, and we have to acknowledge that, have been unfair to certain parts of the world, with the result that people like bin Laden have been able to develop an audience of people who are ready to listen to him. And his modus operandi is to make everybody who does not follow his point of view, he basically anathematizes them and say they are outside of Islam, and that's the idea of takfir. And the other idea that he had made well known is that when Muslims are under attack, they must defend themselves through jihad. Now, jihad is similar to a just war. Historically, jihad was something that was a practice that the early Muslim community had to defend themselves against polytheists who did not want them to live their faith. So they had to defend themselves. But afterwards, as Islam and Muslim power grew stronger, the idea of jihad developed to say that you could also take preemptive action to secure your boundaries and go further and conquer other territories in the interest of God and the Prophet. Right? So we have to be fair about that. So the idea is no longer defensive jihad, but also offensive jihad. Now, obviously, many people would say that Islam spread by the sword. That's not entirely true, but Muslims did do offensive warfare in order to secure their boundaries, to open up the world to the new faith of monotheism the way they understood it. And the truth of the matter is that people that they reached in places like Palestine, in Syria, in Iraq, in North Africa, in Egypt, did not convert immediately. It took 150 years for people to convert. All they did to put their flag down, say, you guys paid taxes to those guys before, now you pay taxes to us, and they moved on. And they moved on through Persia, into India, and established this vast empire in a period of, say, 150, 200 years. Very, very, very quick. But it was a slow process of people becoming Muslim. So it was just basically planting flags, and slowly this grew into an organic way of life. And part of this organic way of life was that it seems that Islamic monotheism did not seem very strange to Christians who saw that these people go down and pray and they got one God and said, well, this is something similar. I mean, and Muslims revere Jesus and they think highly of Mary, and they and you can't insult Jesus or Mary in Islam, it's blasphemous anyway. So there's a great reverence for that. And so they thought that this is a continuity of something similar to what they knew. And truly Islam does see itself as a continuation of the Abrahamic tradition. So this is the idea of bin Laden, of takfir, that is to declare everybody that does not agree to his page of theology that they are outside the fold of Islam. That's number one. And the fact that now every Muslim can do jihad. Now, taking the jihad out of the jihad genie out of the bottle is one of the biggest mistakes that people like bin Laden and people before him have done. Historically, jihad is what we would today call your national defense, what your army does, what a government does. An individual or group of people cannot declare jihad. It is a country or a legitimate political authority that calls jihad. But what has happened is that in the colonial period, when the French, the British, the Spanish and other groups went around the world and occupied Muslim countries and overran their governments, small groups of communities came together and thought to themselves, how do we rid ourselves of these foreigners who've now invaded our countries? And they said, well, we don't have legitimate political authority anymore because our governments have been overrun. Small groups of us must come together and form communities of resistance. And these communities of resistance then said, well, we have a concept of jihad, of self-defense. Now, the mistake there was, and the historical conditions created that, is that now individuals, for a legitimate purpose, used a notion of self-defense that is connected to the motivations and the history of their faith, that jihad could now be declared by individuals and groups of people. But prior to that, you would never find individuals and groups of people declare jihad, because only governments, the Ottoman Empire would declare jihad. The Mughal Empire will declare jihad. The Safavids would declare. These were governments, right? And governments do that in order to defend themselves, or either if they think that they are threatened by others, and then they go and do wars, and that's what legitimate ways in which people did. So one of the big problems have been that the use of jihad in the colonial period, and because the post-colonial period didn't turn out too well for people in Muslim majority societies, that groups like bin Laden and others could then invoke jihad against their own rulers, as well as their own rulers who they called the near enemy and their far enemy, that is people in Washington, in Berlin, in London and others who they think supporting their puppet governments. Okay? We know that story, but it's always good to have that refresher. ISIS emerges, and ISIS grows out of the ashes of Sunni disgruntlement in Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, as all of us know, did not turn out the way it was anticipated, and with the result that the Sunnis were unhappy, the Shiites, took power, and so Abu Bakr Baghdadi arises in that from the ashes of Al Qaeda, and basically does the same things that Bin Laden and Al Qaeda did, except that they now begin to say, we need a system of governance known as the caliphate. And the caliphate is the most only legitimate form of governance that Muslims can have. We've experimented with nation states, with modern nation states in Egypt and Syria. That doesn't work. And we have experimented with forms of democracy. That doesn't work. And in our situation, we need to establish a caliphate. And he declares himself as a caliph. Of course, 99%, if not more, of Muslims around the world don't recognize this caliphate, and they think that he is basically, a stooge of some kind. Now, what we do know is that ISIS is a product of disgruntled Sunni generals and army people in Iraq who have great expertise of how to conduct wars, who got these religious vigilantes to join them, because the brains behind ISIS is not this guy alone. He's just the figurehead. Behind it are disgruntled Sunnis who were in the army, who were major players in Saddam's army that we dismantled, and they don't have a place in that, with the result that this has become a very toxic development that not only attacked people inside Iraq and in Syria, but also they found sympathizers in all parts of the world, and the history of that is clear. We know all the events that happened. Now, the good news is that ISIS, as we are speaking, is being defeated in Mosul, one of their major hideouts in Iraq, and in Raqqa, they will soon be destroyed and hunted out. The question will be, what is ISIS going to do after that? Are they going to become, since they don't have a territory, will they be like viruses all over the world and exercise their violence elsewhere? How are they going to be contained? This is the million-dollar question. But how do you deal with disgruntled people and angry people who feel that the historical injustice has been done to them? Now, ISIS is now also infiltrated into Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, you don't only have the Taliban, who are Afghans, who are rural people, religious people, who have been removed from power and want to get back to power, and now, as we speak, control 50% of Afghanistan. Okay? ISIS now even infiltrated that area and in other areas. So it is a security nightmare for governments around the world. But that's the bad news. The thing is that, as we know this history, the invasion into Afghanistan, many people said it should have been a police operation because nation building wasn't successful, and people argue. You don't have to argue with me, you can argue with your politicians about that. 2003, the invasion of Iraq, obviously, these are the issues of something like Iraq, and the invasion of Iraq is a question of grievance. The whole question of what has happened to the Palestinian homeland and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories that is diminishing there, that becomes a sore point. And the whole question today, we have rising sectarianism between Sunnis and Shias. Sunnis are people who follow a particular So if someone asks you, what is the big issue of Sunni and Shia all about? It's basically a dispute over succession after Muhammad. Dispute over succession after Muhammad. The Sunnis believe that Muhammad's successors are democratically elected, or the community elects them. The Shiites believe that Muhammad designated his cousin and son-in-law Ali to be his successor, but Ali did not get the shot to become the first leader. He only became the number 4 leader after 3 people preceded him, and that had caused a division in early Islam. That's where we have Sunni and Shia. So places like Iran is today majority Shia. In Iran, there are at least 10 to 15% of Shia in Pakistan, in India. There are Shias Zaydi Shias in Yemen right now. There are Shias in Kuwait. Iraq is at least 60% Shia. And so Shia communities around the world, in Bahrain, for instance, where we have our major naval base, there's been a war between Sunnis and Shias. A minority Sunnis rule a majority Shiite community. They're unhappy, they're disgruntled. So political disgruntlement and this conflict between Sunni and Shia has intensified. So right now, most of you who read the newspapers know that Saudi Arabia is engaged in a war and destroying, an ally of ours is destroying Yemen. And today's paper and yesterday's paper, you saw bad news about how Nicholas Kristof just wrote a piece in today's New York Times telling you what the horrors are that is unfolding in Yemen, where one group of people known as the Houthis who are Shiite are being supported by Iran, and the government, whatever remains of the government of Yemen, is supported by Saudi Arabia. So this is a zone of conflict in Yemen. The other place of zone of conflict of Sunni Shia is Iraq. In Syria, it's a Sunni Shia thing there. And around the world, Saudi Arabia and Iran is upping the tensions that even in places like Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Pakistan, in South Africa, Sunni Shia are at each other's necks. And that is creating a lot of disturbances and disruptions in Muslim communities. So this sectarianism is a major issue, and it seems that we, that is the United States, that we seem to have sided with the Sunnis because Saudi Arabia is our major ally. We may want to think about what the implications of that are going to be. That is going to be for us. Then the other political issue is the Kurdish issue. The Kurds are right now helping the United States in northern Iraq, in parts of Syria. Turkey is a larger Kurdish. Are the Kurds going to get a homeland? There's going to be a plebiscite in northern Iraq sometime in September, and there's Baghdad is not very happy about that. That could be another fault line in the region. And the thing is that the Kurds are supporting us in fighting ISIS. Are we going to give them a homeland? And how many enemies are we going to make in the process? So what has this all got to do with Islam? Well, this has got to do with a civilization, a culture, a history, a religious tradition. So these are layers of things. Now, most of us would say, but damn, can't they just have a good government? And can't they just have a proper president? And can't they just have good life and get over with things and stop fighting over theology that went back 1400 years ago? Yeah, they could. They could. But then people must not mess around with them, and we need to give them a chance. And if you give them a chance, they're going to blow each other up. So we think we are going in to make peace and keep things calm. But every time we try to keep things calm, things have just not improved. I mean, our record doesn't show that we could do much. So that the world is there at the end of a fuse. And it seemed that Saudi Arabia or Iran could light it up. And as we know, parts of the world and the Middle East has already been lit up by the violence fomented by them. Now, I referred to Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen and what is happening. And most of you also know this if you read the newspaper, that Saudi Arabia has now, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, have isolated the small country called Qatar on charges that they are supporting, that Qatar is supporting terrorism, whereas it's laughable, that Saudi Arabia and private citizens, everybody's been investing in ISIS. Everybody has been taking a security blanket into ISIS, including the Saudis, it could be the UAE, it could be the Turks. Everybody has been doing that, because what that means is that they think that if they support ISIS, they can defeat Assad, who's the unpopular ruler of Syria. Now, one of the reasons why Iran has become a big player is that Iran has come to the support of Bashar al-Assad, who is the ruler of Syria, and very unpopular, who who squelched a Arab Spring uprising for democracy and used violence, and with the result there was counter-violence, and ISIS got into that vacuum, and we know that Syria as a country, as we knew it, is no longer existing, although most people think better the devil we know, which is Assad, than the devil we don't know, which is ISIS. But Iran is now one of the most powerful countries. Iran has influence in Iraq, Iran has influence in Syria. Iran even now has influence in Qatar, because it is supporting Qatar in Qatar standoff with Saudi Arabia, and Iran last week just sent its ambassador to, Qatar just sent its ambassador to Tehran. So one of the biggest victors in this is Iran, and becoming more and more stronger. Most people in the United States are unhappy about the nuclear agreement, but we can talk about that. At least there is some kind of way of communicating with Iran and European countries, even though the Saudis and the UAE are extremely unhappy about this nuclear agreement. And we can talk about the merits of that. But that is not, I'm giving you this as a background because everything that you read about Islam is filtered through these events. Everything you understand about Islam is filtered through these current events of politics and culture and questions of violence. So what are the underlying conditions? One of the underlying conditions of bad governance, of instability, is that your human resources, your human your talent in your societies become extremely low. So MENA is Middle Eastern and North African countries, has relatively low rates of female labor force participation. So large exclusion of women from the labor force. And that means that women are not empowered. Women don't have economic power. The slide also further shows, that another indicator of where the men and women ratios in the labor force. I mean, Kuwait and the UAE and Qatar does better than say a big country like Egypt or Morocco, for that matter, or Jordan or the West Bank or even Yemen. Okay, Djibouti doesn't do too badly. So you as people who have a great experience of the world understand the role economic prosperity plays, and the absence of economic prosperity can result in many disadvantages. Bad education. Saudi Arabia, our ally, has been teaching its population some really unhappy things that are not even consistent with Islam, a very extreme form of Islam that basically say that all other religions other than Islam is false. So you can well imagine what kind of psyche is created in young Saudis in their attitudes towards other people of other faiths, Jews, Christians, Hindus, and so on. And it's only recently that Saudi Arabia has changed that. So if you think about that, who were the majority of the people who were the attackers on 9/11? 17 of them were Saudis, right? And yet that did not alter our relationship with Saudi Arabia. We went after Iraq, and there was not a single Iraqi involved in that. Now, there's something that I'm missing out. Maybe you can fill me in on that. Saudi Arabia, 5th grade textbook, saying that you cannot be friends with anybody else other than Muslims. That's a very narrow prism to think about life. And if you have that kind of thing drummed into you day in and day out, what is your view about the other? Right? Now you might say, I've met some really wonderful Saudis when I was CEO of this place. They're really nice people. Yeah, there are nice people in Saudi Arabia. I've met some really extraordinary people, open-minded people too. But the Saudi Arabia has a struggle within itself between ultra conservatives and people who are wealthy and have been educated abroad and have a cosmopolitan viewpoint, and that results in an internal conflict where the conservatives and the ultra conservatives dominate and dictate what the agenda should be. And Lions Club and all these kind of things are seen as not acceptable to certain kind of teachings, and the biggest problem is the whole question of conspiracy theories. When people are powerless or they are wrongly educated, conspiracy theories abound. So people don't have facts at their disposal, they have conspiracies. So 9/11 is the American conspiracy. And where do all these conspiracies come from? From the United States. So there are all these people who talk about fake news, that Sandy Hook never happened, remember? Obama created Sandy Hook, right? Sandy Hook never happened. Those brilliant videos that are made that says that 9/11 did not happen, that the American intelligence agencies destroyed the buildings, produced in the USA. That the Apollo landing never happened. It happened in the Mojave Desert, right? And ABC carried those stories and so on of these people who believed that this was fake news. So these things go viral globally, and many people purchase and buy into it. So we should not take this lightly, because to have factual knowledge, to have a full understanding what the real world is instead of an imagined world, is the beginning of a serious conversation. Then we know where we are. Otherwise, we're not on the same page. And we cannot deal with ourselves in this country in the way based on bad facts. And we cannot have real global relations based on incorrect information and facts. So what this all results in is what I call a deficit of dignity. That in the Muslim world, especially in the Gulf, with this extraordinary amount of wealth, that even the most wealthy Saudis, Kuwaitis, and others don't feel that they have dignity. Everybody laugh at them, make fun of them, that they are Arabs, they are, all kinds of, funny names are used, that, that they, relationship to camels, or the kind of headgear that they wear, that there is no self-respect. The world doesn't respect them. There's no self-worth that they find in that. And therefore, the elites imitate Western lives, and those who don't have it imitate a traditional lifestyle that they think it's much more authentic, right? So that's it. And that's because a deficit of dignity. And the poverty, maybe not in the Gulf, but in places like Egypt, Sudan, places like Morocco, Algeria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, high levels of poverty. And it takes a demagogue like Bin Laden or ISIS to go into a chat room and tell a young person aspiring to become something in a poverty-ridden Bangladesh that the way that you can get through into this world is to completely alienate yourself from America and its forces, Western elites in your country. They are your number one enemy. You need to come back to something very fundamental and basic, like those Saudi teachings that we just had there, that makes you feel strong and good within yourself, that you are authentic and you are true. That's the only true authenticity that you can have, and they buy it. Because they could be an engineer, they could be on college. You know what happened in Dhaka a year and a half, 2 years ago, where these young people, shot up that whole place. It's because of a certain psychology and an impoverishment and a deficit of dignity, a poverty of dignity. And it's in the poverty of dignity, both of self-confidence, lack of education, that demagogues can exploit. But it's not only demagogues that exploit. This is the point that you need to hear. Even people who govern countries in democracies, who we think are respectable people, they also use religion. So take a country like, for instance, Malaysia, fairly stable country, good levels of growth and human flourishing. From time to time, you'll find Malaysian politicians trying to out-Islamize each other, who is going to be more authentically Islamic, and use theology as a way to beat the opponents. Many of you might have followed the whole story that happened in Indonesia, where a Christian governor of Jakarta, his name was Ahok. He's got a long name that I can't remember, but his nickname is Ahok. And Ahok was already elected to office previously. He came up for re-election this year. His opponents used certain statements that he made and said he's anti-Muslim, and basically through demagoguery accused him of blasphemy. He's in jail right now, and his opponent is now the governor of Jakarta. But the president of Indonesia, he is what I would call a fair-minded guy, doesn't have the courage to give Ahok pardon, because he knows this is a trumped-up case, right? He should be able to do that, but he doesn't do that because out of political expediency. Now, the centrality of dignity is a core teaching of Islam, if you would want to be reminded of that. The Quran very clearly talks about how human dignity is the cornerstone of our existence, and that all of the children, not Muslims, not Jews, not Christians, but all of humanity has dignity. All of humanity. And then the verse continues and said that God has provided you with the good things and given you the capacity to excel, and that you can go over the lands and the sea. This whole idea that you can go over land and sea and inhabit the land and inhabit the sea in order to make for yourself a life, of flourishing, is the essence of dignity. When you can use the gifts that God has given you, your natural talents, your abilities, but also the gifts of the environment, you use that optimally, that is what we call a life of dignity. Now, it's nothing strange. Muslim jurists and thinkers, this name Ibn Rushd, you might think it's an Arabic name, but he is well known in the Latin world as Averroes. Averroes was a great philosopher. And Averroes, who writes on philosophy but also writes on Islamic theology and Islamic law, points out that the key teachings of Islam, the principal virtues, are the norms of dignity. That when you have chastity, when you have the virtue of justice, when you show courage within yourself and you show excellence and generosity and all those virtues, you are a dignified person. So these teachings are not strange to Islam. They're not estranged. This is the core teachings of Islam. So what has happened? What has happened is that human dignity can only be restored, and human flourishing can only happen when these kind of goals, the sustainable goals of the UN about, when human beings can have, when we fight poverty, no hunger, good health, and all these 17 goals, when that is in place, then you have dignity. Then you have a life of flourishing. And you can always visit this. This has now become the agenda of the United Nations to spread these teachings around the world. And this is the core teachings that any religious tradition can also relate itself to these 17 goals of peace and justice, the question of life on land, how to preserve this life below the water, climate action. All these kind of things are the important goals, and I think many people don't know about it. We have not talked about this greatly in this country as a national and international agenda, and we need to bring religious communities into this conversation to support this, because I think this is one of the ways in which we can restore and bring. See, I think bombing people out of Raqqa and Mosul is one way to get the threat away, but doesn't end the threat. There has to be a constructive program, and we have to put our best minds together to find the solutions. So when I talk about Islamic reform, I'm talking now about the language Muslims use themselves, is this idea of Islah. Islah means to make good, to heal. It's like what in the Jewish tradition they talk about tikkun alam, right? To make the world a better place, to heal the world. Islah is also one of those things that Muslims have talked about a great deal. Muslims also have a concept that talks about this idea of ijtihad, that every human being must exercise their mental faculties and their gifts and their talents and abilities and learning in order to find the common good, to find ethical norms and moral norms in the best way. Each one of us have that obligation. It's not only the obligation of some people, but each one of us have that obligation. Now this question about resistance to reform, where does this come from? Resistance to reform is, why did the Muslim world require reform? The Muslim world required reform because something came onto its shores, and that is modernity. Modernity happened in Europe. The Ottoman Empire was large and big. It realized that Europe had some kind of technologies. It wanted to buy into that. European powers entered the Muslim world, brought modern education to Muslims, taught them how to speak French, speak English, speak other kind of languages and so on, and brought with them modernity, a new way of approaching the world. So modernity comes to the Muslim world as tainted because it is not indigenous. It comes on the back of firepower. It comes on the backs of occupation. some Muslims think about modernity as a good thing. You need science, you need technology, you need modern medicine. They embrace it. But some people think that, yes, we can have cars, we can have planes, we can even have nuclear bombs. But when it comes to the interpretation of our faith tradition, we're going to rely on the old knowledge. In other words, when it comes to the interpretation of theology, of the moral norms that were produced in 7th century Arabia, that has evolved over time within Muslim societies, and up till within Muslim society, Islamic norms developed, and they changed over time according to the circumstances. But this big change that modernity brought in, that modernity said basically that, religion, it can be a force, but religion is a private thing. In the public sphere, you need different kinds of secular norms, right? That's what modernity said. Modernity began to say that, the world is a world of causation, of science, and this idea of believing in angels and believing in those kind of stuff, an enchanted universe, where the universe has all kinds of magical powers, we should leave that for bedtime stories and maybe for Sunday school, right? Let's not talk about that in a serious way about that. So, but this idea that religion will adopt new knowledge of the time, sociology, modern philosophy, to begin rethinking itself within Muslim communities, that was seriously resisted. So what you have in many Muslim societies is the following. You have modern educated people, and they are tutored and they are educated by theologians who 80 to 90% of them don't have a modern education. They rely on old medieval texts. They think that is authentic. That's where the teachings lie. Some of them could adapt and make changes on the fly, so to speak, but there's no systematic rethinking of the theology. There's no systematic rethinking of how does Islamic ethics and norms now deal with the new challenges. So therefore, in a very rich country like Saudi Arabia, you have the theology that they teach the kids that I just showed you on the slide, right? One would have thought that in a place like Saudi Arabia, there would be really resources to think through how does Saudis and Muslims live in the world that will be compatible to what is in their souls, what is in their minds, what practices they have, would be compatible to questions of justice, equality, men and women are equal, people who have other faiths are people with equal dignity, you have to respect them, they are your brethren in humanity. But you have the opposite teachings of isolation, teachings of hatred, okay? Why is that? Because the old theologies have not been subjected to the new experiences. Because what is new knowledge? Any society that has new knowledge is based on your new experiences. So even though modernity reached the Muslim societies, and many Muslims have new experiences, their experiences do not translate into a new theology, into a morality that is compatible with the world in the way they experience. So there is a schizophrenia. And I know many Muslims are unhappy if I speak like that, but I've been to the most orthodox, and I've studied in the most orthodox madrasas in South Asia. I've studied 6 years in a seminary in India, where I learned the most orthodox teachings. I know the classical tradition. I know all those kind of things. And so that is very, very a key issue. And so the question is, the two main areas, the domains that we need to address, that Muslims need to address are the political and the religious, theological, and the ethical. Right? Those are the domains that they have to address. And therefore the need to restore a vibrant and relevant tradition. Tradition is important. Those of you who are Catholics, or even you are Protestant, of any other, you know how important tradition is. Tradition is important. Tradition is the place where your memories are embedded. But not all parts of tradition are relevant today. Some parts of tradition you must say goodbye to, right? And you have to depart and have a very nice burial for some parts of tradition. But there are other parts of tradition that you renew and you make a new tradition. So the example I give of how to rethink tradition is, this is the mosque of Ibn Tulun that was built about 250 years after the beginning, after the inception of Islam in Cairo. And this is a beautiful building. This is a ablution block These are very interesting, architectural features. This feature here of this tower and this minaret might have resemblance to a mosque in Samarra, and Ibn Tulun had this built. And so in Qatar, a place that I have frequent contacts with and so on, when they decided to build a museum of Islamic art, they decided that they're going to get someone by the name of I.M. Pei, a world-renowned architect, and who also designed the Kennedy Museum and many other important places. They got him, and he traveled around the Muslim world, and he looked at architectural features, and he renewed aspects of this in the Qatar Museum of Islamic Art. So tradition in art and architecture can have another life, provided that one has it in a way that is also meets the needs of the present. So tradition can have continuity, but it requires a certain amount of innovation. That's exactly is my plea to fellow Muslims and also to people like you. Many of you, you have a familiarity with Islam, to understand the big, crises that Muslims are going through. And that crises are what we call the crisis of knowledge, right? The knowledge question. I already mentioned it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. That new knowledge represents your new experiences, right? And there are new truths that we have to deal with. And those truths also, you don't change, you have an understanding of God, you understand God's prophet, those kind of things. But the reality in which God and the prophet comes into is a very different reality. Not only in America, but also in Egypt, also in Djibouti, in Pakistan, in Indonesia. There are new realities, there are new environments. And the old teachings cannot survive in those environments. In fact, it creates a disharmony. And so the crucial thing that many of you might have heard about is something called Sharia, right? Sharia is, and you know that in 20-odd states in America, there are a legislation banning Sharia. Well, you are basically banning the common good, because Sharia is the common good. Sharia stands about all the good things, the ethical norms. Now, are there people who advocate crazy forms of Sharia? Yes. There are people who advocate, crazy forms of Sharia in Pakistan, floggings, cutting of hands, and so on and so forth. Yes, but that is their version of Sharia. Mainstream Muslims believe that Sharia is about the common good, how to advance the good, how to be ethical, how to be just, how to do all the right things that everybody else does do. So, for instance, Muslims pray 5 times a day, they fast, they give taxes, they do all those kind of things. That's all part of Sharia. It's like telling Jews that they cannot practice halakha, right? Which is a certain practice of rules and regulation, ethical practices. And Sharia literally just means the path, this path to water. And Sharia means it's a moral path. Like the path of to water in a desert is something crucial, because in a desert you need water. Similarly, in the world of morals, the path to morality, the path to ethics is absolutely crucial. Now, I will stop here and basically tell you that there are 2 versions of the Sharia. If anything, forget everything I said. I'm sure you're not going to forget. I think I'm very impressive. No, I'm kidding. Forget everything I said about the historical background, the political. If people ask you what is Sharia, you're going to say it's about the common good. But the 2 things is that there are 2 versions of the Sharia. What I call Sharia as a telephone directory, and Sharia as the Taj Mahal. You know what the Taj Mahal is? A beautiful building, okay, in India. Sharia as a telephone directory is these detailed rules and regulations that people have written down, and many of those rules are outdated and they have not been written. Okay, so that is the currency, the going currency, in many Muslim jurisdictions. They still follow Sharia as a telephone directory, and most of you know that we don't have telephone directories anymore, right? We go to Google to look for a number. But I'm just giving the example, so don't tell anybody Sharia is a telephone directory, okay? Please don't do that. I'll be really embarrassed. What I'm saying, I'm just giving an example, Sharia as a kind of a detailed teaching, detailed document. But if you really begin to think about what is the core of Sharia, what is the essence of Sharia, the big picture of Sharia, what I call the Taj Mahal version of the Sharia, then Sharia is about preserving. Sharia is about preserving 5 things. Preserving religion, preserving human life, preserving intellect, preserving property, and preserving family life. This is not something I've made up. This is something that goes back to Islamic teachings right to the 11th century. And Muslim scholars are unanimous about it. But this is what we have right now is a conflict of two kinds of literacies. The literacies for the telephone directory and the oral teachings, and the literacy for the one that gives you the big picture version of Sharia. Now, I think most people with common sense can relate to Sharia as the big picture. Who's not going to be out for protecting human life, protecting property, protecting intellect, protecting all those good things in life, right? We are all very much agreed on that. This is the core of Sharia. So if anybody tells you Sharia is about cutting off hands and so on and so forth, you know which version of Sharia that is. That is the telephone directory version of Sharia. The details that are no longer relevant to what's name. But this is not an easy thing to say. You say this, if I say this in Muslim jurisdictions, people are going to go to war with me. They're going to say you are denying and rejecting what God and the Prophet has said. So it's a long conversation to get fellow Muslims on this page. Okay? Long conversation. And my solution is that in moral and ethical teachings, wherever Muslims are, we can no longer have teachings of Islam in ethical or theological dimensions that violate human dignity. Human dignity is the core. I know human dignity is also something that historically evolves, that there was a time when we had slavery in the world, and there was time that women were in a different place, that they occupied the aspiration we have today. And not all parts of the world women have equality, but it's an aspiration. And human dignity also goes into that. At one stage, it would have been okay to have emperors, but today we no longer tolerate emperors, right? So that's the key issue. And so one of the major things that we need to address in Islam, and that's the battle, the inside battle within Islam, is how to get the core values of Sharia into a space that Muslims can have a moral consensus on the big issues. And lastly, I would say the following. The question of the political is the crucial thing. The key issue is that in many parts of the Muslim world, the political theology of what an Islamic order must be has not been settled. What an Islamic political order must be has not been settled. Some people want a secular governance. Some people say secular governance has not worked, therefore we need to have a modern Islamic governance, something like Turkey. Something like Turkey, we have a modern state, but the Islamic party can rule, although many people are now worried that Erdogan has now become quite despotic and authoritarian. Some people look at Malaysia and Indonesia as majority Muslim democratic countries where Islam and democracy can coexist. Or other people think that no, Iran is a better model where you have a certain amount of theocracy and a certain amount of limited democracy, that order. This question of the political theological is the number one question that is still a burning issue. When we went into Iraq as America, and we thought we were removing Saddam Hussein, we discovered Ayatollah Sistani. And we said, what is that? Right? We went in there to create a secular government, and we discovered Ayatollah Sistani, and that Iran is ruled by majority Shias, and he's a cleric and a theologian. And we then realized that, oops, it's not going to be that easy. And that's precisely because this political theological question is the burning issue. And unfortunately, Muslims in the majority Muslim societies today don't have the space to discuss this democratically. What is the future going to be? In Pakistan, there is a secular government, but there's so much religious tension within the society that they can't talk about these issues openly. In Egypt, General Sisi, removed a democratically elected government of Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood, removed him, and with the result that Egypt is in the most dire straits ever. So the two big questions of reform is in the area of theological and ethical reform, and the big conversation there is about how does one get Muslim theologians and Muslim communities to come onto the page where their lived experiences become part of a new narrative about Islam and about God and about the Prophet and about moral values. And the other big issue is the question of the political. How do you create stable societies where human beings can live with dignity and people can flourish? Because without that, you're going to have all kinds of instability within and without, and stable parts of the world are going to become unstable because instability can flow through the air, it can flow through migrants, it can come through all kinds of things, and it creates instability. So we are all in this global world, we are all together into it, and it doesn't mean that you can just ward off and build big walls, in Europe and other places and keep people out. That's not good. We have to work in a collective way to bring those parts of the world that they arrive at answers themselves and not we provide them the answers. There must be a real honest stock taking and a real clear way of thinking how we are dealing with the Muslim world. We have the capacity, we have knowledge in this country, really solid knowledge of people from a wide variety of backgrounds, that we can at least begin to understand the complexity before we make policy. We might not have the right policies, but we can at least understand the various moving pieces. See, we think that all solutions can be done by generals. Generals know one thing, they know how to win a war. But some wars are not winnable. And many of the generals will tell you that. But if you give them instruction, they're going to say, give me more guns, give me more troops, we're going to do that. But you need, to help the generals, you need wisdom before that. And you need the wisdom, that the collective wisdom we have in this country, learning from our experiences, that we can be the instrument of good around the world. And we can make parts of the world stable if we use better policies and better outcomes. And then I think the people will respect us in the way they respected us before. And America still has a lot of support outside, and people still want to come into this country and have a better future. But I must tell you that in many parts of the world, we are looking very bad. I cannot have a conversation in many parts of the world when people point fingers at me and hold me accountable for everything that has happened. And I'm an American citizen, so I have to take part of that responsibility. And that's what you do. But I'm also doing this work here to teach you and to talk to you and educate you and show you sources that you might be able to be the agents of change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.